Hi there, therapists and future private practice therapist owners. If you're setting up your own therapy practice, you probably already know that paperwork is a huge part of the job. But don't worry, I'm here to make it easier for you. In today's vlog, we're going to talk about the 6 essential documents that every private practice needs for their therapy practice. These aren't just any forms. They're the foundation for an ethical, professional, and legally sound practice. So whether you're just starting off or looking to improve your current setup, I've got you covered. Hi, my name is Carmen Spears, and I am a licensed clinical professional counselor in California and Maryland. As a therapist, I specialize in grief and loss, trauma, and anger management. I've had my own therapy practice for over 10 years. I also have experience working for numerous therapy agencies, mental health practices, and outpatient mental health centers. I'd like to welcome you to my channel, Guiding Light Therapy. Now, the first form we're going to talk about is the client consent for services. Now, depending on if your practice is insurance-based or private pay-based, you're going to want to have 2 forms for this. And we'll talk about a little bit of some of the differences for these. So within the client consent form for services, this is going to contain really just like important information for clients consenting to therapy services. Some things in this is going to be talking about the client-therapist relationship. It'll talk about available services, whether that's group, whether that's individual, whether it's like family. Other things is going to be the risk and benefits. Yes, even though it's counseling, we still want to talk about, some of the risk and benefits. For example, therapy may be, uncomfortable, may bring up, different emotions. It's going to talk about, counseling, addressing like the benefits of counseling, and also talking about how your agency or private practice is going to be addressing maybe like certain different issues. Other things might be like the goal as far as a therapeutic experience that they might experience while in therapy with you or at your practice. Another section is going to be appointments. Appointments might talk about the frequency, the length of it, the contact information as far as like how to reach you. Another section we want to talk about is electronic communication. And this is going to be so important in this day and age. So this is going to include things such as the telephone, the internet, whether it's texting, whether it's voice messages, and even email. So it should talk about how you plan on utilizing those and if there's any limitations and restrictions also. Now, if we're talking about insurance, it's going to mention as far as insurance filing for payments. So if someone is looking to get, reimbursed through insurance, you're going to need, certain information, and also is consenting to let them know that information from the therapy, not so much specific, but certain information will have to be revealed in order to get reimbursed. Some of this is going to include a diagnosis. It may include a treatment plan, depending on, which insurance it is. Then there's also something about out-of-network benefits. So out-of-network might mean that maybe you're paying out of pocket, but once again, you want to submit to get reimbursed. And so once again, they're going to want, certain information in order to have the client get reimbursed. Now, if we're talking about private practice, when it comes to payment, it's going to talk about your policies, for payments. Payment might be before the session. It might be 24 hours. It might be, right after, and maybe a little bit about how you're going to charge for that. Following through with that, we'll talk about the fee schedule as far as how the different fees that you have. So the different fees that might consist of the fee schedule might be the intake session. Typically, this is going to be a longer session. So it's going to be, a higher rate. Additional sessions might be, individual. That would be a type of fee, family sessions. If it's going to be private pay, you're probably going to want to list some of these fees. If it's insurance, it's going to be taken care of by the insurance. But if for some reason something happens with the insurance, you still might want to have the fees, covered. Other things might be whether it's a return check fee or different type of written reports or other type of documents that therapists might be, signing off on, for clients in therapy. And then once again, talking about, the payments as far as whether it's electronic, whether you have a card on file, how you'd like to go ahead and handle those. And then even emergencies. I mean, emergencies happen, and, with therapists, we are in business too. So we need to have, some type of emergency policies to protect us with that. And then confidentiality is going to have a little bit of confidentiality on it as far as talking about that, such as, things between the therapist and the client, they are confidential. Of course, there are some limitations. Duty to warn, to protect, that would be one. Incapacity or, death, that would be a certain circumstance. And at the end, you just want to, once again, kind of summarize that by signing or filling this out, that you are consenting to treatment and all the terms within it. So that's going to be the first form again. And once again, that is the consent for therapy services. And that might be called different names. Now, the next form we're going to talk about is going to be the consent for telehealth services. This is also a consent form. Now, you might combine this in your regular consent forms, or you might want to do a separate one. I choose to do this as separate. And depending on your state laws and your boards, they might require, specific things, for a telehealth consent. So some of the things that are included in this is going to be the nature of telehealth. So for example, it's going to involve, having some type of video. Some states or boards may allow, audio to be used maybe in lieu of or in addition. Once again, talking about confidentiality, and, there might be some, limitations specifically as it relates to telehealth therapy sessions. Once again, there are benefits and there are risks when it comes to, telehealth. Benefits such as not having to worry about traffic, transportation, risk as far as maybe the, connection, or maybe, privacy as far as where you're at. We can't, control the privacy or confidentiality where you are physically at. Definitely want to talk about emergency procedures specific to telehealth, therapy sessions as far as, what's going to happen. Typically with this, you always want to get the person's physical location if they're not at their home when doing telehealth, just in case. And then you also probably want to have, an emergency contact person in case you need to, contact that. Hopefully not, but you definitely want to make sure you have it. Another thing is talking about electronic health record system. That could be included in that. And that's just going to be the way of how you're maybe storing notes, information, as far as how you're inputting information, and even the platform. And they might already be exposed to that if you're using that to send the consent forms for them to sign and or the treatment plans, and possibly, other things such as payments that this can cover, all of those things. And then once again, at the end, you're going to have the general consent to telehealth paragraph statement stating that you agree to the telehealth, consent to receiving therapy by telehealth. And depending on your board, so for example, in California, they also want you to get, verbal consent. And that can just consist of, when you get in the therapy sessions, the first one, you also let them know that add an additional verbal statement to get their verbal consent to. So that is the second form, the consent for telehealth therapy sessions. Now the next form that you want to include is going to be the Notice of Privacy Practices. And this is also referred to as HIPAA, spelled HIPAA. Now this notice is going to describe how medical information about you may be used and disclosed. And as far as how you can get access, meaning if the client needs or wants to get access. So you're probably familiar with this, and clients should be familiar with this as it relates to a lot of medical offices. Basically what it does is it includes kind of an introduction as far as the HIPAA, the policy, notice of privacy practices, what it's used, how it's used, talks about how we maintain privacy of, the different documents and information that you are receiving. And then also talks about the uses and disclosures requiring authorization. Some of those things we mentioned already before, such as, treatment, we're going to need certain information. For payment, there's certain information. It might talk about healthcare operations, and also authorization again, as far as authorization relating to applicable laws, and talking about if you want to know more specifically about how your information is going to be used, how you can, request this, verbal permission. I know we talked about that before for telehealth. Other things are going to be like abuse and neglect, talking about how we're not going to abuse it, we're not going to neglect the information, we're going to take the proper procedures to make sure that it's, contained, that it's sealed, that people can't, get access to it, talking about how we're going to follow requirements, of the law enforcement, national security, public safety, duty to warn. And this talks about if there's like immediate, threat, if information like needs to be disclosed, like what are the reasons it might need to be, emergencies. If there's deceased patients, there's, certain procedures when it comes to that, unfortunately. Other things that may be included that is going to be the client's rights and the therapist's duties. So yes, the client, they do have rights. As far as right of access to inspect their information, maybe copies, if they want to amend maybe certain things, right to request as far as maybe restrictions, maybe they don't want some people to have, access to things. And as we talk about the therapist's duties, this section is going to talk about basically almost like your pledge as like a therapist as far as protecting this information, keeping it, confidential, about how you might disclose this information. Once again, some reasons are going to be patient payments, maybe healthcare operations, if you're working with, someone else. And with that, it might just be release of information. For example, maybe no medical provider or another medical provider, whether it's with need, maybe based on consent, or maybe based on necessity. And then another section might talk about certain uses, disclosures that require your authorizations, the whole section on there. Things that might not require your authorization. Some of these are going to relate to like laws, states, things like that. And then once again, talking about, the rights that you have in respect to your information. So as you can see, there's like a lot in there, and a lot of people don't actually go through and like read all these. It's a lot of, standard. However, it is important that we have these things, that we have these forms, that we are sending them, and that we are getting them, signed. So once again, you're going to have like the acknowledgement of receipt of policy notices. And with that, it's going to be something where they are going to sign it, and then they should also, get a copy, or they might just be able to access a copy if it's done electronically. So now the fourth form is going to be the release of information consent. And this is going to allow us to be able to talk to someone else and to share information. So for example, maybe they want us to be able to talk to their doctor, a medical provider, maybe a previous therapist, maybe an agency, maybe they need some paperwork, filled out. What this does is this gives us permission to talk to them. And in order for the other party to be able to talk to us, they can either sign this, or they might have, their own release of information forms, which you might receive or you may not. So for example, if the client signs my release as a therapist, that means I can talk, to them. And if the client also signs a release for the other provider, they can talk to us. So that's how this works. So in my consent forms, I like to have it where they can check off to send and receive. To inform might just be like, who it's, going to. You definitely want some type of contact information. I think a phone number is always the best. In addition, email address, I would say probably be second best. Definitely want to get at least one of those. And then even an address. One thing to think about too when you do the release of information is if the person is part of an agency or company, you might also want to list like that company, not just the person's name, because it gives you information. Allows you to talk to not just that person, but maybe someone else. Maybe they're on vacation, they're not available. So there's not as many, restrictions. And then with me, as far as like cutting down on some forms, I also use the release information as an emergency contact. How this works is there's just a box there that says, hey, is this an emergency contact? They would check off yes or no. And there's another section in my forms that I do relationship to the client. So that just kind of lets you know like who. And then also I like to include a section as far as different types of information that they want to be, released. So that gives them, autonomy to choose that. So for example, medical history, evaluations, it could be treatment plans, progress notes, treatment plans, maybe just a discharge summary. So they can kind of check that off as they would like to. So once again, that form is the release of information, and I personally also use it for emergency contact. Now, the fifth form is going to be the attendance agreement and cancellation policy. And this is going to be so important. And depending on whether you are insurance-based, private practice, maybe use some third parties, for example, EAP, employee assistance programs, or even state-based as far as maybe Medicare, Medicaid, they might have like their own policies. So with that, you kind of would almost like divert to that if needed, but otherwise it would just be like, your own policy. So when it comes to that, it might be, what's the policy before, they're charged, like the cancellation. Typically, 24-hour notice is, pretty standard. Some therapists even do, 48 hours. So those are different things you want to think about. Cancellation, you want to think about which things are going to be excused cancellations, which are not. The policy I have, it's kind of like general, because you do want to, protect yourself too as like, a business owner. Typically, if it's one of those things where it's a lot of, cancellations due to maybe things you're not quite sure if you should or shouldn't like allow that, that's probably a therapy conversation to kind of, iron those out. You also want to account for as far as how many minutes, and two, it's going to be considered, like late. Because if we're considering, like with us being, therapists, like, our time, I mean, not to be cliche, but our time, it is money. And we also are bound by what, insurance might say, what maybe an EAP, even in private practice, you might want to have your own policy. And it's so important to keep these consistent. Some people might say, hey, 10 minutes late to cancellation. Some people might say, 15. Whichever you choose is fine. You just really want to be, consistent. And then also, no showing up. And for me, for my policies, I consider like late cancellation, no shows, kind of the same, policy, meaning like the same, consequences if they fall into those. You might want to do, a certain number of sessions, maybe consecutive sessions. Maybe they just lose like a time slot. So once again, I kind of keep it not like too strict, somewhat general, but it has to be, restrictive enough where it is protecting me as the business owner. Because I mean, we are businesses. And in order to best serve, our clients, we do need to have these privacy practices, these cancellation practices, these no-show practices. And the sixth essential form that you definitely want to have is a credit card authorization policy. Now, chances are if you're already using the electronic health record system where you're already charging cards, they're going to have like their own little statement or policy with that, which is fine. This doesn't take away from this. I would say think of this as adding on like an extra, protection, for yourself. So with this, you want to think of depending like how you're doing the charges. So you might be doing 24 hours, maybe it's 48 hours. Reasons you might do this might just depend on your cancellation. You want to do it almost like within. So if the cancellation is 24 hours, you might do it maybe, 16 hours, before the session. That's an example of that. I like to have a credit card just on file regardless. I typically try to do that for really just like all the clients, just in case. I think it's just best. And then depending on electronic health record system, or if you're just kind of billing manually, then you can go ahead and, do that billing. You don't have to wait for a card. And then doing it beforehand, you don't have to worry so much about if there's, not enough funds and stuff. And once again, this really helps to protect you. It lets the client know that the card will be charged, when it will be charged, and how much it will be charged. Basically, it should be a pretty straightforward, like policy. Once again, you want to make sure this is protecting you. You want to list, like what, the fees are that's going to be charged for things, if needed. And then once again, as they're signing this, they're agreeing to this. They're saying that, hey, I've received this. I agree to it. I do, acknowledge it. Having the right paperwork is one of the best ways to protect yourself, your clients, and your practice. These 6 essential documents will help to keep you to stay organized, set clear expectations, and maintain a professional and ethical business. If you want to save time and avoid the stress of creating these forms from scratch, I've got a solution for you. You can grab all of these forms fully customizable from my Etsy store. Just click the link below in the description. And don't forget to follow me on all my social media channels for more tips and resources on running a successful therapy private practice business. I share helpful insights, business strategies, and more ways to make your practice thrive. Please like, hit the subscribe button, and share this video. If you found this video helpful or would like to leave a comment or suggestion, just drop it below in the comment section. And remember, you matter, your story matters, your growth matters. See you in the next video.